In America, police officers are sworn to protect and serve. But what happens when the very people we trust with the badge cross the line into corruption, violence, and even murder? These aren't just mistakes or lapses in judgment. These are stories of betrayal, cover-ups, and crimes so shocking you won't believe they came from women who once wore the uniform. From officers who staged fake shootings, to detectives who carried out cold-blooded revenge, to cops who secretly plotted murder for hire. These cases show the dark side of power and authority. Tonight, we're diving into the most evil female officers of America you didn't know. And before we begin, drop a comment below telling me where and what time you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want more true crime content just like this. Yvonne Wu, NYPD, USA. It was the evening of October 13, 2021, in the quiet Brooklyn neighborhood of Bensonhurst, New York. The streetlights had just flickered on, and families were finishing their dinners behind drawn curtains. At around 5 p.m., a 911 call shattered that ordinary calm. A woman's voice, panicked and desperate, begged for help. Shots had been fired inside a home on 19th Avenue. When officers arrived, they found a scene that was both shocking and deeply unsettling. 2 women had been shot. One would not survive, and the other was critically wounded. But what made the case even more chilling wasn't just the violence itself. It was who the shooter was. The person standing at the center of this crime scene wasn't a stranger, wasn't a career criminal. It was one of their own, a police officer with the New York Police Department. Her name was Yvonne Wu. To the public, Wu had always been a figure of respect. She had served nearly 5 years with the NYPD, working out of the 72nd Precinct in Sunset Park. Colleagues described her as disciplined, committed, and reliable. She wore the badge proudly, presenting the image of a woman dedicated to protecting her city. But behind that uniform, beneath the reputation of a trusted officer, Wu was carrying something darker, an emotional storm that would eventually consume her. The victims in this case were not random strangers, they were deeply connected to Wu's personal life. One of them was Jenny Lee, Wu's ex-girlfriend. Their relationship had ended months before, but Wu had not let go. Jenny had begun seeing someone new, Jamie Liang, a 24-year-old woman described by friends as vibrant, kind, and full of life. For Wu, the new relationship wasn't just painful, it became unbearable. The love triangle created tension, jealousy, and an undercurrent of obsession. And on that October evening, it all erupted in violence. According to prosecutors, Wu had gone to Jenny Lee's home that night. Witnesses later said Wu was already inside the house when Jenny and Jamie arrived. At some point, confrontation turned into catastrophe. Wu pulled out her service weapon and opened fire. Jamie Liang was struck multiple times and died at the scene. Jenny Lee was also shot, but managed to survive, though critically injured. Neighbors reported hearing the chaos, a mix of screams and gunfire echoing down the block. And then, silence. When police rushed to the house, they didn't have to chase a suspect. They didn't have to search the neighborhood or canvass witnesses. Yvonne Wu was waiting for them. Reports say she stood calmly outside the home, unarmed, and told the officers exactly what had happened. "I shot them," she allegedly admitted. It was the kind of confession that stunned even seasoned detectives. An NYPD officer, one of their own, was standing there, acknowledging she had just taken the life of a young woman and nearly ended another. In the days that followed, more details came to light. This wasn't a random explosion of anger. Wu's actions revealed the complexity of a crumbling relationship and the psychological unraveling of someone who had sworn to uphold the law. Investigators learned Wu had struggled with the breakup and had expressed jealousy over Jenny Lee's new relationship. Prosecutors argued that this was not a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. It was a calculated ambush, a decision to end the lives of 2 women caught in the middle of her emotional turmoil. For the NYPD, the case was devastating. An officer's personal heartbreak had turned into a public tragedy, and the department had to face the uncomfortable reality that one of their own had weaponized the very trust placed in her. The wheels of justice turned slowly. Wu was initially charged with murder, attempted murder, and criminal possession of a weapon. Years later, in July 2024, she finally entered a plea. Wu admitted to her crimes, pleading guilty to manslaughter and attempted murder. The court sentenced her to 27 years in prison. The outcome brought some closure, but it could never erase the loss. Jamie Liang's family mourned a daughter and sister whose life had been cut short. Jenny Lee was left to live with physical and emotional scars, and the NYPD was left with the stain of betrayal from within its own ranks. Kim Potter, Brooklyn Center PD, Minnesota, USA. It was April 11, 2021, in the small city of Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. A Sunday afternoon. The streets were quiet, families were going about their day, and for most people, it felt like any other spring weekend. But for 20-year-old Daunte Wright, that ordinary afternoon would never reach its end. What began as a routine traffic stop would spiral into one of the most infamous cases of police betrayal in modern American history. And at the center of it all was Officer Kim Potter. On paper, Kim Potter was the kind of officer most communities would say they wanted. She had spent 26 years with the Brooklyn Center Police Department, climbing the ranks, mentoring younger officers, and even serving as a training officer. She had a reputation for being calm, professional, and respected. Her colleagues saw her as dependable. Her record had no major controversies. In the eyes of the public, she represented stability, the image of a career cop who had seen it all and who, after more than 2 decades of service, knew exactly what she was doing. That's what made what happened next so hard for many to understand. Because behind that badge, behind the years of supposed experience, one decision, one irreversible action, would destroy not only her career, but a family, a community, and the fragile trust between officers and the people they swore to protect. Daunte Wright wasn't a stranger to the system. At just 20 years old, he was a young man still figuring out his life. On that April afternoon, he was driving with his girlfriend when officers pulled him over. The stop was over an expired registration tag and an air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror, both minor issues, the kind of infractions most people expect to handle with a citation or warning. But when the officers ran his name, they discovered an outstanding warrant. It was related to a missed court appearance for a misdemeanor charge. For the officers, that was enough to escalate what should have been a short encounter into an arrest. And that's where Kim Potter stepped in. Body cam footage would later reveal what happened in chilling detail. As officers attempted to arrest Daunte Wright, he pulled away and got back into his car. At that moment, Kim Potter shouted the words that would echo in every courtroom and headline for years to come, "Taser! Taser! Taser!" But in her hand was not a taser. It was her service weapon. A single shot rang out. Daunte Wright drove a short distance before his car crashed into another vehicle. Moments later, he was gone. Kim Potter, standing in shock, could be heard on her body camera saying, "I grabbed the wrong gun. I shot him." Those words became the foundation of her defense and the source of endless outrage. Potter claimed it was a tragic mistake, that she had intended to deploy her taser, but instead drew her firearm. To many, that explanation sounded impossible. After all, Potter wasn't a rookie. She was a 26-year veteran. She had trained countless other officers on proper weapon use. She had handled her firearm and taser for decades, and she knew, as every officer is trained, that the taser is holstered on the non-dominant side, while the firearm is always holstered on the dominant side. The two weapons are different in weight, shape, and feel. Even their color, bright yellow for the taser, dark black for the pistol, made them distinct. So how could a veteran officer with years of training make such a mistake? Was it panic? Poor training? Or something far deeper? A mindset where the line between protection and aggression had blurred beyond recognition? For Daunte Wright's family, the explanation didn't matter. What mattered was that their son was gone, and the person responsible was someone sworn to protect. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension quickly took over the case. Public anger erupted within hours of the incident. Protests spread across Brooklyn Center and beyond, reigniting the nation's debate over police accountability and use of force, especially in the wake of George Floyd's death, which had occurred less than a year earlier, just miles away in Minneapolis. Kim Potter resigned from the force within days. The police chief also stepped down, but resignation wasn't enough. Prosecutors charged Potter with first- and second-degree manslaughter. In December 2021, the case went to trial. The jury was shown body cam footage again and again, replaying the moment Potter pulled the trigger. They heard from experts on police procedure, from colleagues who trained under her, and from Potter herself. She testified through tears, insisting that she never meant to harm Wright, that it was a mistake she would live with forever. But the prosecution argued something else, that after 26 years of service, Kim Potter knew exactly what she was doing, that her actions weren't just a mistake, but a gross abuse of authority, a reckless disregard for human life. In December 2021, the jury found her guilty on both manslaughter charges. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a sentence many viewed as far too lenient for a life taken. In April 2023, after serving just 16 months, Kim Potter walked free. For the Wright family, there was no release. The weight of loss would remain forever. And for the CUMD, the message was chilling. Even when officers are held accountable, even when a jury delivers a guilty verdict, the punishment rarely feels equal to the crime. Kim Potter's case forced Americans to confront a painful truth, that the badge, meant to symbolize protection, can sometimes become a shield against responsibility, that a single decision, made in a moment of panic or poor judgment, can destroy lives, and that the people we are told to trust the most, the ones trained, paid, and sworn to serve, can also become the ones who take everything away. Kim Potter may have been released from prison. She may one day try to rebuild her life, but the name Daunte Wright will never leave the shadow of her actions. His death was not just the result of a mistake. It was the result of power, of authority mishandled, and of a betrayal that shook an entire nation. Christina Hambie, DeKalb County PD, Georgia, USA. It was the evening of September 19, 2018, in DeKalb County, Georgia. The stretch of road near Wesley Chapel and South Hairston was calm, lined with streetlights and small businesses closing down for the night. For most drivers, it was routine, another drive home on a weeknight. But at 11 p.m., that routine was shattered. In a matter of seconds, 2 innocent lives were gone, and the driver responsible was not some reckless teenager or unknown stranger. It was Officer Christina Hambie, a sworn member of the DeKalb County Police Department. At first glance, Hambie did not fit the picture of what people imagine when they think of corruption or evil in law enforcement. She was not tied to an organized crime ring. She wasn't the mastermind of a conspiracy. On the surface, she was an ordinary police officer, uniformed, trained, entrusted with protecting her community. To colleagues and neighbors, she was steady and professional. The badge she wore symbolized safety. But on that September night, she made choices that betrayed that trust in the most devastating way possible. The victims that night were Shirley Gibbs, age 54, and Catherine Lewis, age 68. 2 women with families, friends, and futures of their own. They had no connection to Hambie. They were not suspects. They weren't even in any kind of confrontation with her. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when her patrol car barreled toward them at a deadly speed. The sequence of events unfolded with chilling speed. Hambie was driving her marked patrol vehicle at 74 miles per hour, more than double the posted 35 mph limit on that stretch of road. What made it even more disturbing was that this wasn't a response to an emergency call. There were no flashing blue lights, no sirens. She was not racing to save a life. According to investigative reports later presented in court, she was simply driving, recklessly, without regard for the laws she had sworn to enforce. As Hambie approached the intersection, she lost control. Her cruiser slammed into the victim's vehicle with such force that both women were killed almost instantly. The quiet road turned into a scene of chaos. mangled metal, flashing lights, and cries of disbelief from bystanders who couldn't understand how a uniformed officer had created such devastation. In the immediate aftermath, there was confusion. Fellow officers arrived on the scene, many of them stunned to see that it was one of their own behind the wheel. Normally, law enforcement shields the public from reckless drivers. But here, it was the protector who had become the danger. As word spread, the community demanded answers. How could an officer, trained to value life and public safety, drive so recklessly? Why was she speeding through a non-emergency situation? The investigation quickly turned its focus to Hambie's conduct. Crash reconstruction specialists examined skid marks, speed data, and vehicle damage. Witnesses were interviewed. The truth became undeniable. Hambie had been driving at more than twice the speed limit in a residential area, endangering everyone around her. This wasn't just a tragic accident. It was negligence on a criminal level. Prosecutors moved forward with charges of vehicular homicide, along with reckless driving and failure to maintain lane. In Georgia, vehicular homicide is among the most serious charges a driver can face, especially when it stems from willful disregard of safety. As the legal process unfolded, more unsettling layers were revealed. Officers are trained extensively on vehicle operation, especially in high-speed conditions. They know the responsibility that comes with the sirens and the badge. Hambie wasn't a rookie. She wasn't unaware of the risks. She made a choice: to drive at speeds that had no justification, to gamble with lives that weren't hers to gamble with. In court, prosecutors emphasized this point. This was not fate. This was not chance. It was a conscious betrayal of training and duty. For the families of Shirley Gibbs and Catherine Lewis, the pain was immeasurable. Their loved ones had been taken not by crime, not by a random tragedy, but by a sworn officer. The very institution meant to uphold order had delivered chaos to their doorsteps. At sentencing, relatives spoke of the hole left in their lives, the birthdays, holidays, and milestones that would never be shared again. The contrast between Hambie's public image and her actions could not have been sharper. To the community, she was supposed to embody protection. Instead, her recklessness erased 2 lives and shattered families. The court found her guilty of vehicular homicide. She stood before the judge not as an officer, but as a convicted felon. The badge could no longer shield her. She was sentenced, forced to face the weight of her actions, though for many, no prison term could ever equal the lives lost. When we reflect on this case, what stands out is not just the speed, the crash, or the charges. It is the betrayal of responsibility. Officers are given extraordinary authority. They can carry weapons, make arrests, and are entrusted with decisions that affect lives every day. With that authority comes an obligation to value life, to uphold the law, to model restraint. Christina Hambie abandoned that obligation the moment she pressed down on the accelerator without reason, pushing a patrol car to deadly speeds. And when she did, 2 innocent women paid the ultimate price. Today, the memory of Shirley Gibbs and Catherine Lewis stands as a reminder that accountability must apply to everyone, even those sworn to uphold the law. When officers cross that line, whether through intent or neglect, they must answer for the damage they cause. And for the community in DeKalb County, the image of flashing blue lights on that September night will forever carry a bitter meaning. It was not the light of safety, but the light of loss. Alfreda Fluker, Birmingham PD, USA. It was the night of April 10, 2020, in Birmingham, Alabama. A quiet evening for most of the city, but inside one car parked along the side of the road, chaos was unfolding. In the driver's seat sat Alfreda Fluker, a decorated veteran of the Birmingham Police Department. She was someone who, for over 15 years, had been trusted to uphold the law, to bring calm to crisis, and to serve as a protector in one of Alabama's largest cities. But that night, the protector became the predator, and her story would go on to shock not just Birmingham, but the entire country. To the public, Detective Alfreda Fluker was the definition of experience. She had worked some of the city's toughest assignments. Colleagues knew her as a no-nonsense investigator, a woman who carried herself with authority, and someone who had the badge, the years of service, and the reputation to prove it. But like many stories of betrayal, the surface image was only part of the truth. Behind closed doors, Fluker's life was tangled in secrecy, jealousy, and emotional chaos. She was involved in a complicated relationship with Mario White, a fellow Birmingham police detective. It was a relationship that was far from simple and far from stable. Then there was Kenesha Fuller, a 43-year-old woman with her own life and dreams. She had recently been connected romantically to Mario White as well. To Alfreda, Kenesha wasn't just another woman. She was a rival, someone she saw as standing in the way of the man she believed should have been hers alone. This triangle of love, betrayal, and resentment was about to end in the most tragic way possible. That April night, Alfreda learned that Mario and Kenesha were together. The discovery ignited something inside her, a blend of rage, hurt, and betrayal. Alfreda followed them, driving through Birmingham until she spotted them in a car. Moments later, under the cover of night, Alfreda confronted them. What should have been a moment of reflection, of restraint, or of walking away, instead became a violent act that would forever define her life. She opened fire into the car, striking Kenesha Fuller. The woman Alfreda saw as her rival never stood a chance. Mario, too, was left shaken but alive, forced to witness the horror of what one of his fellow detectives, someone he had once worked alongside, had just done. The chaos of the shooting shattered everything. The officer who once swore an oath to protect life had, in one reckless act, destroyed it. The Birmingham Police Department moved swiftly. Alfreda was arrested almost immediately. For the officers who had known her, the news was unthinkable. A detective with years of service had just committed the very crime she was sworn to prevent. The police chief at the time, Patrick Smith, addressed the city directly. His words carried the weight of betrayal. "This is not a reflection of our department. This is a reflection of one person's choices." It was a reminder that a badge doesn't make someone immune to the darkest parts of human emotion. The investigation that followed was straightforward, but it carried heavy emotional weight. Evidence placed Alfreda at the scene. Witnesses, including Mario White himself, confirmed the timeline. Ballistics tied her weapon to the shooting. For detectives and prosecutors, it was a clear case, but for the city of Birmingham, it was more complicated. How could someone with the training, experience, and sworn duty of a police officer allow jealousy and rage to lead them down such a destructive path? This wasn't a rookie mistake. This wasn't a lapse in judgment on a difficult call. This was deliberate. This was personal. By the time the case went to trial, the world was still in the grips of the COVID-19 pandemic. Courtrooms were quieter, but the silence only made the details more haunting. Jurors heard how Alfreda had tracked the couple, how she had confronted them, and how her weapon ended Kenesha's life. They listened as Mario White recounted the horror of watching his fellow officer, someone he had trusted, pull the trigger. The defense tried to argue passion, emotion, and lack of intent, but the facts told another story. In 2022, Alfreda Fluker was found guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the community, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but also lingering questions. Alfreda had been one of their own, a woman trusted to investigate crimes, to serve justice, to wear the badge with pride. Instead, she became the very thing she had once sworn to fight against. For Kenesha Fuller's family, the loss was permanent. They had lost a daughter, a friend, a loved one. No sentence, no conviction could ever replace her. For Mario White, the scars were invisible but deep. He not only lost someone he cared for, but he also carried the memory of that night, a memory tied forever to someone he had once worked beside in the same department. And for the Birmingham Police Department, the case was a painful reminder that the uniform is no guarantee of integrity. For most officers, it represents service, sacrifice, and protection. But in the hands of Alfreda Fluker, it became a mask, one that hid jealousy, rage, and instability until the night it all came crashing down. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a betrayal of trust, of oath, and of community. Alfreda Fluker will never walk free again. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars, serving the very punishment she once helped deliver to others. But the shadow of her actions lingers. Antoinette Frank, New Orleans PD, USA. It was the night of March 4th, 1995 in New Orleans. Inside the dimly lit Kim An Vietnamese restaurant, the evening seemed ordinary. Families gathered around steaming bowls of soup, the atmosphere warm and welcoming, as it had always been. But before the night was over, that safe space would become the site of one of the darkest betrayals in New Orleans police history. A betrayal so cold and calculated that even today, decades later, it still shocks anyone who hears it. And at the center of it all was not a hardened criminal from the streets, but a uniformed police officer. Her name was Antoinette Frank. On the surface, Antoinette Frank represented everything the community expected of an officer. Born in 1971 in Louisiana, she joined the New Orleans Police Department in 1993. She was young, ambitious, and to the public eye, a woman who had worked her way into one of the city's most respected positions. To many, she seemed approachable and professional. She wore the badge, she spoke with authority, and she projected the image of someone sworn to protect. The Kim An restaurant itself trusted her so deeply that she was welcomed inside like family. The owners allowed her behind the counter, even into their private space. That was the image Antoinette carefully maintained. But beneath that uniform, something else was brewing. The restaurant, owned by the Wu family, had a special relationship with Frank. They often served food to officers, and Frank became a familiar face. But over time, the family began to notice something unsettling. She wasn't just a guest. She acted entitled, almost as if she owned the place. Despite those warning signs, the Wu family never could have predicted what would come next. Among those working that night were Ha Vu, the daughter of the owners, and her younger siblings, Quang and Ha Lien. They trusted Antoinette Frank. They believed the badge on her chest meant safety. Tragically, that trust would be shattered forever. On the night of March 4th, Frank entered the restaurant alongside her boyfriend, a 19-year-old named Rogers Lacaze. He was no stranger to trouble, already entangled in petty crime. Together, Frank and Lacaze had begun plotting ways to gain money fast. Their target? The very restaurant that had welcomed Frank as family. According to witnesses, Frank had been inside earlier that evening, checking the layout, almost as if scouting the place. Hours later, she returned with Lacaze. This time, it wasn't as a friendly visitor. It was as an intruder. The pair demanded money, taking cash from the restaurant. But in a decision that revealed her chilling mindset, Frank went further. In the back of the restaurant, her fellow officer Ronald Williams, who was working an off-duty security shift, was shot and killed. Two members of the Wu family, Ha Vu and Quang Vu, were also gunned down inside the restaurant. In one night, Antoinette Frank destroyed not only lives, but the sacred trust between community and police. At first, the idea that a police officer could be responsible seemed unthinkable. The surviving Wu family members, including a young daughter who managed to escape and hide, immediately pointed investigators toward Frank. They told detectives what they had seen: Frank's face, her voice, her presence. The betrayal was almost too much to process. A woman they had trusted to sit at their tables was now being accused of orchestrating one of the city's most cold-blooded crimes. As investigators dug deeper, the evidence grew undeniable. Antoinette Frank's police-issued badge and presence at the scene were impossible to explain away. Witness testimony, physical evidence, and her connection with Lacaze all painted the same picture. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was a planned act of greed and violence carried out by someone sworn to uphold the law. Detectives pieced the timeline together quickly. Surveillance evidence, witness accounts, and the surviving Wu family members gave a consistent story. Lacaze, the younger boyfriend, had been reckless, but Frank was the one who knew the ins and outs of the restaurant. She knew when Williams would be there. She knew how the Wu family worked, and she knew the layout. The trial that followed captured national attention. To see a police officer, especially a female officer, stand accused of such a crime left the city shaken. Prosecutors described Frank not as a protector, but as a predator who used her badge to gain trust before tearing it apart. Her defense tried to claim that Lacaze had acted alone or that Frank was under his influence, but the weight of the evidence crushed those arguments. The jury didn't just see a young officer caught up in the wrong company. They saw someone who had abused the badge in the most unforgivable way. In 1995, Antoinette Frank was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Officer Ronald Williams and siblings Ha Vu and Quang Vu. The court sentenced her to death, one of the rare times in U.S. history where a female police officer has received that punishment. Her accomplice, Rogers Lacaze, was also convicted and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later reduced to life in prison. Today, Frank remains on death row in Louisiana, still awaiting the ultimate consequence for her actions. What makes Antoinette Frank's case so chilling? Isn't just the violence of the crime, but the psychology behind it. Unlike many officers who lose control in moments of panic or error, Frank's actions were calculated. She used her badge as a mask. She leveraged trust for personal gain. Her motive, prosecutors argued, was simple: money and control. But beneath that, many believed there was something deeper: a resentment toward authority, a willingness to cross lines, and a dangerous attraction to a life of crime that her badge had been meant to protect against. The case stands as a stark reminder that the uniform doesn't always reveal the truth about the person wearing it. For the people of New Orleans, the betrayal cut deep. Officer Ronald Williams wasn't just a victim. He was a protector, gunned down by someone who wore the same uniform he did. The Wu family lost children in the very place that had been their home and business. And the community at large learned a devastating lesson. Even those who swear an oath to protect can sometimes become the very threat they fear. The Kim An restaurant closed after the tragedy, never reopening. Its doors remain a haunting reminder of the night when trust was broken in the most violent way possible. Sherry Hall, Jackson PD, Georgia, USA. It was September 13, 2016. In the quiet town of Jackson, Georgia, just after midnight, an urgent call came over the radio. An officer claimed she had been ambushed while on patrol, shot in the line of duty, and barely survived. That officer was Sherry Hall, a newly hired policewoman with the Jackson Police Department. The details she gave were chilling. She said she had pulled into a secluded cul-de-sac, an area she claimed was known for trouble. She described how a black man suddenly appeared from the shadows and, without warning, pulled out a gun. She told dispatch she had been shot in the torso, her bulletproof vest stopping the round just in time. Within minutes, her story spread across the department. Officers rushed to the scene, sirens cutting through the night. They believed one of their own had narrowly escaped with her life, and they immediately began searching for a suspect. Sherry Hall wasn't just another officer in uniform. At the time, she was presented as a symbol of community policing, someone who wanted to make a difference in a small Georgia town. Residents saw her as approachable, professional, and dedicated to her work. She had only been with the Jackson Police Department for a few months, but her presence gave the impression of someone deeply invested in public safety. In the media, Hall appeared calm and resolute, presenting herself as a survivor of a near-fatal attack. To many in the community, she represented courage under fire, a woman who was willing to risk her life in defense of others. But behind that image was something far darker, something that would eventually unravel her career, her credibility, and her freedom. In this case, the victims weren't just individuals, but an entire community. When Sherry Hall made her claim, she gave a specific description of her supposed attacker, an African man. That single accusation triggered fear, tension, and suspicion throughout the community. Innocent residents suddenly became potential suspects in a manhunt that should never have existed in the first place. But Hall's lies also victimized her fellow officers. They rushed into danger, believing a shooter was on the loose, believing their colleague had narrowly survived an attempt on her life. Her false story betrayed their trust, risked their safety, and undermined the very oath she had sworn to uphold. At first, her story seemed convincing. Officers discovered that Hall had fired her service weapon that night. They also found damage to her vest, consistent with her account of being shot. The police department mobilized. Roadblocks were set up. Neighbors were questioned. And within hours, local media outlets were reporting on an attempted murder of a police officer. Hall stood before cameras, describing how she had looked evil in the face and survived. The image of a lone female officer being targeted stirred anger and fear across Georgia. But as investigators dug deeper, cracks began to appear in her story. The first red flag was forensic evidence. When her bulletproof vest was tested, analysts noticed something unusual. The damage suggested that the shot had been fired at close range, not from an attacker standing in the shadows. Ballistic tests raised even more doubts. Investigators determined that the bullet in her vest came from her own department-issued weapon, the very same gun she carried that night. The inconsistencies didn't stop there. Sherry Hall's radio calls and timing didn't line up with her narrative. No witnesses reported seeing the attacker she described, and the surveillance cameras in nearby areas showed no sign of a suspect fleeing the scene. What started as a case of a heroic officer under fire soon began to look like something much different, a fabrication. As investigators pressed Hall for details, her story began to shift. At first, she stood by her claim of being ambushed. Then, when confronted with the ballistic evidence, she suggested she might not remember everything clearly. But eventually, the truth became undeniable. Sherry Hall had staged the entire shooting. She had fired her own gun, placed a bullet into her vest, and called it in as if it were an attack. The motive? That remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. Some believe she sought sympathy and recognition, perhaps even hoping to advance her career by presenting herself as a survivor. Others suggest she was driven by deeper psychological struggles. But the consequences were devastating. Her lie not only endangered innocent people, it fueled racial tensions, casting suspicion on black men in the community and exploiting stereotypes for personal gain. By 2017, the evidence against Hall was overwhelming. She was arrested and charged with multiple counts, including making false statements, tampering with evidence, and violation of her oath of office. In court, prosecutors painted a clear picture. Sherry Hall had betrayed her badge, her colleagues, and her community. They emphasized how her lies diverted law enforcement resources, spread fear, and risked igniting unrest. Her defense argued that she was under stress, that she was struggling personally, and that the incident was less about malice and more about desperation. But the jury didn't accept that explanation. Hall was convicted and sentenced to serve time in prison. The woman once hailed as a courageous officer had become a symbol of dishonor and deceit. Mary O'Callaghan, LAPD, USA. It was the night of July 22, 2012 in South Los Angeles. The streets were quiet, but inside one modest home, a mother named Alicia Thomas was struggling. She was battling personal issues, overwhelmed by circumstances most of us can only imagine. That night she made the heartbreaking decision to take her children to the local police station, hoping the system could protect them better than she could in her fragile state. It was a desperate act of love, one that tragically set into motion the events that would end her life. And standing at the center of this tragedy was a veteran LAPD officer, Mary O'Callaghan. Mary O'Callaghan had worn the LAPD badge for nearly 2 decades. To the public, she represented authority and order, an officer sworn to serve and protect. In her uniform, she looked like the face of discipline, law, and stability. But beneath that image, there was something else. Colleagues had described her as tough, direct, and often impatient. Few imagined that one day her actions would embody the very opposite of justice, forever staining her career and her name. Alicia Thomas was not a criminal mastermind, not a threat to society. She was a 35-year-old mother fighting personal battles, struggles with mental health, with dependency, with stability. That night, when officers were dispatched to her home, the call wasn't about violence or danger. It was about a mother in distress. A mother who, despite her flaws, was trying to do the right thing for her children. What followed should have been routine, a simple, professional arrest, followed by resources and intervention. Instead, it turned into something darker. When officers arrived at Thomas's home, they decided to take her into custody for child endangerment after she left her children at the precinct. Thomas complied. She was handcuffed. She walked outside to the patrol car. But from there, the situation escalated. Officer Mary O'Callaghan arrived on scene and quickly inserted herself into the arrest. As officers attempted to place Thomas in the back of the squad car, she struggled, distraught and frightened. She was restrained but panicking, and that was when O'Callaghan crossed a line. Witnesses, and more importantly, dashcam footage later revealed what happened next. Instead of calming the situation, instead of treating Thomas with the dignity owed to every human being, O'Callaghan used excessive force. She kicked Thomas. She kneed her. She struck a woman already restrained, already helpless. Moments later, Alicia Thomas collapsed. Within hours, she was gone. For the public, it was unthinkable. An LAPD officer, sworn to protect life, had instead brutalized a vulnerable woman in crisis. The betrayal went beyond physical force. It was a betrayal of trust. Citizens call police in their most vulnerable moments, expecting help. Alicia Thomas had handed her children over to the system, believing it might save them. But the very system she turned to became the force that ended her life. The LAPD couldn't ignore what the footage revealed. The dashcam video captured O'Callaghan's actions, kicking and kneeing a defenseless woman. The department placed her on leave, and the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office pursued charges. But the case wasn't straightforward. Proving intent, proving causation between her actions and Thomas's death would be difficult. Medical examiners later ruled Thomas's cause of death as undetermined, citing complications from her health and possible drug use. That uncertainty meant prosecutors couldn't charge O'Callaghan with homicide. But what they could prove, and what the video made undeniable, was assault under color of authority. In 2015, after years of legal proceedings, Mary O'Callaghan was convicted. The trial painted two portraits. On one side, the defense argued O'Callaghan was a tough officer dealing with a resistant suspect. They suggested her actions were attempts to control a chaotic situation. But the prosecution had the video. They had the clear evidence of her unnecessary kicks and knees. They had the reality that Alicia Thomas was already handcuffed, already under control, and in no way a threat. The jury sided with the evidence. O'Callaghan was found guilty of assault. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, though under California's rules, she served less. This case is not just about a crime. It's about what happens when authority turns abusive, when power is used to harm instead of to protect. For Alicia Thomas's family, no verdict, no conviction could bring her back. Her children lost a mother. They will carry the weight of that night for the rest of their lives. For the LAPD, the case was another scar on a department already struggling with public trust. Each incident like this doesn't just stain one officer's name, it ripples out, casting doubt on the many good officers who uphold their oath with honor. And for the public, it was another reminder that wearing a badge does not guarantee morality. Trust is fragile, and once broken, it is almost impossible to repair. The story of Mary O'Callaghan forces us to ask hard questions. How many other cases go unseen without cameras to capture the truth? How often do vulnerable people suffer at the hands of those meant to protect them? And how do we as a society hold authority accountable when it betrays us? In the end, this isn't just about one officer. It's about the fragile line between power and abuse, and what happens when that line is crossed. If you've made it this far into the video, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now where you are. And if you want more deep dive true crime documentaries like this one, don't forget to subscribe for more stories uncovering betrayal, corruption, and the crimes you didn't know about. Valerie, Cincinelli, NYPD, USA. It was May of 2019, on Long Island, New York, when federal agents moved in on a woman who had once sworn an oath to serve and protect. Her name was Valerie Cincinelli, an NYPD officer, a mother, and by all outside appearances a decorated public servant. But behind closed doors, she was plotting something that would shake the public's trust in law enforcement to its core. For years, Valerie had been seen as a committed officer. She joined the NYPD in 2007 and built a reputation as someone tough, outspoken, and willing to face the challenges of New York's streets. To neighbors, she was the young woman who had made something of herself. To her colleagues, she was a peer in uniform, standing on the same thin blue line. But what nobody knew at the time was that Valerie's personal life was deeply troubled. Her marriage had collapsed. Custody battles over her child created constant tension, and resentment toward her estranged husband began to grow into something darker, something dangerous. At the center of this case were two intended victims, Valerie's estranged husband, and even more disturbing, his teenage daughter from another relationship. It wasn't just bitterness or custody disputes anymore. Valerie was willing to cross the unthinkable line of wanting both of them permanently gone. Her resentment became an obsession, and by early 2019, she had begun discussing ways to make that obsession a reality. The plan began in whispers. Valerie confided in her boyfriend at the time, a man named John DeRuba. She talked about money, about hiring someone to take care of her estranged husband. Then, as her bitterness deepened, she added his daughter to the plan. But Valerie wasn't careful. She trusted the wrong person. What she didn't know was that DeRuba went to the FBI. He told them everything, and from that moment forward, every conversation, every step, and every detail Valerie gave was being recorded. The FBI instructed DeRuba to keep communicating with her. He did, capturing her words as she laid out a plan in chilling detail. Valerie agreed to pay $7,000 to have her husband killed. When she suggested adding his teenage daughter, the case shifted from disturbing to horrifying. The FBI wanted evidence, and so they staged a scenario to make Valerie believe the plan had gone through. They sent DeRuba photographs of a crime scene, her husband, apparently lifeless in his car. These images were staged with federal agents, but Valerie believed them to be real. When she received the photo, her reaction was not shock or grief. According to investigators, she gave a chilling response that confirmed her intent. She believed she had successfully arranged the deaths of two people connected to her. What she didn't realize was that her own words, her own reactions, were sealing her fate. On May 17, 2019, Valerie Cincinelli was arrested. Federal agents moved in after gathering enough evidence to prove the murder-for-hire plot was real, deliberate, and intentional. The news spread quickly. The public was stunned. A New York City police officer, someone entrusted with authority and a badge, had been accused of plotting the deaths of her own family. Her arrest shook not only the NYPD, but the community she had once vowed to protect. For many, it was a betrayal of the deepest kind. Looking at Valerie's case, investigators and reporters alike struggled with the question, why? She wasn't a criminal outsider. She wasn't desperate for survival. She had a steady job with one of the most prominent police forces in the world, and yet, the bitterness in her personal life, custody disputes, financial stress, and a fractured marriage consumed her to the point of destruction. Instead of walking away, instead of seeking resolution through the courts, Valerie made the choice to cross the line. She allowed resentment to become obsession, and obsession to become conspiracy. When Valerie appeared in court, the weight of the evidence against her was undeniable. Recordings of her conversations, the staged photographs, and the testimony of her boyfriend all painted the same picture. She had not only thought about the plan, she had actively pursued it. Initially, she was charged with murder for hire, a serious federal offense. But as the case developed, prosecutors focused on what they could prove beyond doubt. Valerie ultimately pled guilty to obstruction of justice for destroying evidence related to the investigation. In November of 2021, she was sentenced to 48 months in federal prison. While some believed the sentence was light compared to the severity of her actions, it nevertheless ended her career in law enforcement and cemented her name in history as one of the most shocking betrayals of the badge. The betrayal in Valerie's story is what continues to haunt people, Here was someone with the authority to enforce the law, plotting to break it in one of the darkest ways possible. The case forced many to question trust, not just in one officer, but in the system that produces them. For the victims, the trauma extended far beyond the legal outcome. Jacqueline Villaseñor, Chicago PD, USA. It was the year 2004 in Chicago, Illinois, a city where law and order was meant to be upheld by those who wore the badge. But in this story, the lines blurred. Behind the uniform of a sworn protector stood a woman who wasn't just struggling with a failed marriage. She was plotting the ultimate betrayal. Her name was Jacqueline Villaseñor, an officer of the Chicago Police Department. And rather than choosing the lawful path, she tried to manipulate the very system she swore to protect. On the surface, Jacqueline was a trusted member of the force. Colleagues described her as competent, a steady officer who handled her duties with confidence. She blended into the everyday fabric of law enforcement, just another officer patrolling the streets of Chicago. To neighbors and acquaintances, she was a woman with a family, trying to balance the strains of personal life with the relentless demands of police work. But what people didn't see was the turbulence beneath that image. Jacqueline's marriage had crumbled, and her relationship with her ex-husband had grown hostile. Divorce left scars, financial disputes, custody battles, and bitter resentment. What could have been settled through courts and lawyers took a far darker turn. The target of Jacqueline's anger was her ex-husband. They had once shared a life, but by the time the divorce was finalized, communication had turned into confrontation. The bitterness consumed her, and soon, resentment transformed into obsession. For Jacqueline, this wasn't just an ex-partner. In her mind, he became the enemy, and rather than keeping her oath as an officer of the law, she began plotting something far more sinister. The story truly began when Jacqueline crossed a line no officer should ever approach. She solicited someone she thought she could trust to help her carry out a plan, to have her ex-use ban permanently removed. The conversations weren't casual, nor were they empty threats. They were calculated. She promised money. She laid out the scenario. What Jacqueline didn't realize was that every step she took left a trail. Every word she spoke carried weight. She wasn't acting as an emotional spouse in a moment of weakness. She was methodically attempting to arrange a contract on her ex-husband's life. This betrayal didn't stay hidden for long. Word of Jacqueline's plan reached the authorities, and suddenly the woman who wore the same badge as her investigators became their primary suspect. To prove what she was plotting, law enforcement used the same methods they applied to street-level criminals. Conversations were recorded, meetings were monitored, and piece by piece, the horrifying reality emerged. Jacqueline Villaseñor wasn't just venting frustration. She was serious. The recordings revealed her intentions. Her words, cold and unflinching, left no doubt. It wasn't anger in the heat of the moment. It was a decision, carefully made. A police officer, a person meant to protect, was now exposed as someone willing to orchestrate violence for personal revenge. Once the evidence was secure, investigators moved forward with charges. The Illinois courts confirmed what had unfolded. Jacqueline Villaseñor, a sworn officer of the Chicago Police Department, had solicited the murder of her ex-husband. In the courtroom, the facts were laid out with chilling clarity. This wasn't a mystery. It was a betrayal in plain sight. The prosecution highlighted her training as an officer, her understanding of the law, and her knowledge of consequences. She knew exactly what she was doing, and yet she moved forward anyway. Her defense argued desperation, emotional strain, and the impact of her failed marriage. But for the jury, the betrayal of her oath overshadowed excuses. What makes Jacqueline's story so haunting is not just the crime itself, but the contrast it reveals. Officers are trained to navigate domestic disputes, to resolve conflicts before they escalate. Jacqueline had first-hand knowledge of the devastation such cases could bring. And still, she weaponized her authority, turning personal bitterness into a deadly conspiracy. This case forces us to ask difficult questions. How does someone sworn to uphold justice rationalize breaking it so completely? Was it pride? Was it revenge? Or was it the belief that her position as an officer could shield her from consequence? Ultimately, Jacqueline Villaseñor was convicted. The Illinois appellate records confirmed her guilt. For the victim, her ex-husband, the trial was a chilling reminder of how close betrayal had come from the very person he once trusted most. For the Chicago Police Department, it was a stain that couldn't be ignored, a reminder that evil doesn't always come from strangers lurking in the dark. Sometimes it hides behind the uniform, the badge, and the authority we are taught to trust. When police officers themselves cross the line, it doesn't just shock communities, it shakes our entire trust in the system meant to protect us. These cases raise a difficult question. How do you feel knowing that those with power and authority can commit such acts of betrayal? I want to hear your thoughts. Which of these cases stood out to you the most, and why? Do you think the punishments fit the crimes? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And if you want more true crime stories like this, broken down every day with care and detail, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. There are more stories coming, and each one will leave you questioning the people we think we can trust. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next story.